You know that not people being interviewed on the television, perhaps they're living in East Anglia or they're living somewhere abroad, and they say, I'm full of hiriaeth, I want to go home. And it's a lovely Welsh word that speaks of a longing for a homeland and a homesickness in a sense. There are some Hebrew words that are difficult to translate as well. And there's a word which begins with the same letters as hiriaeth, which is in this psalm, and it's the word hesed. I'm sure, knowing the preaching that you have from this pulpit, week by week, that word's been introduced to you before now. The word hesed is a beautiful Hebrew word. It's a word that sometimes is translated love. Sometimes in the Bible it's translated loving kindness. Sometimes it's translated mercy. Sometimes it's translated covenant goodness, because it is all of those things. It is God's covenant loving kindness to his people. And here in Psalm 36, that Hebrew word appears 3 times. And so although the psalm sets out to be about the wickedness of men, in glorious contrast, the psalm speaks to us about God's loving kindness, the loving kindness that we've just sung about in that hymn. It's there in verse 5. In the New King James Version, it's translated mercy, but that's the word. It's the word hesed. Your hesed, your mercy, your loving kindness, O Lord, is in the heavens. Precious is your loving kindness, O God. And then it's there in verse 10, where it says, "O contis." I want us to use as our base this morning as we look at this lovely psalm. In a sense, it speaks to us about why we need God's loving kindness, then about how precious God's loving kindness is, and then how we need to pray for God to continue his loving kindness to us. So that's where we're going in the psalm this morning. Our need for it. The seriousness of sin, don't we? David is right life. We're surrounded by wickedness. They're out, and even from people within his, perhaps from that. Before, if you wanted, there is no rebellion. Why do we see such a... The fear of God isn't before our eyes, doesn't it? You see that salted our eyes, evil words, members. In verse 4, he devotes no fear of God, relates his wicked plans. When he wakes up in the night. When he wakes up in the night, he reminds himself that God is still there. And he thinks about God. And he thinks about God's thoughts to him. And he rejoices in the God. The wicked, do our thoughts go towards God? He sets himself in a way that is not good. He does not abhor evil. You see how comprehensively sin has affected the wicked. You see how wickedness is all. David looks round, just 2 of other people. He knows, look at this psalm this morning, but we haven't got to turn back very far, have we, to, isn't it? The Lord does not impute iniquity. All the day long, for day and night, acknowledge my sin to you. See, there were times in David's life when sin got hold of him, wasn't there? And we think of that psalm, or we turn on to Psalm 51 and his great psalm of confession after that awful incident with Bathsheba. And so David knew, didn't he? He knew what wickedness was. He knew how serious sin was. He'd experienced in his own life. This man who wrote these wonderful psalms, this man who wrote, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." He knew what sin was like. He knew how serious it was. And so, because of that, he thanks God for his mercy. He knows he needs his mercy. Isn't there a lovely switch in the psalm here between verses 4 and verse 5? You see, he stops thinking about the wicked. He stops, even as it were, thinking about his own wickedness, and he thinks about God, doesn't he? You notice verses 5 and 6. They are lovely verses about God, aren't they? You see, sin is serious because of verse 6. Sin is serious because God is a God of righteousness and God is a God of judgment. You see what he says there? Your righteousness is like the great mountains. What a great picture that is. Maybe you're off on your holidays in the next few weeks. And perhaps you're going up to North Wales. And one of the things you love about North Wales is those majestic mountains. We've got some mountains around here, haven't we? But when you get to North Wales, so much bigger, aren't they? So much more brutal. They're so much stronger. Or maybe you're going to the Lake District, and there are big mountains there. Or maybe you're going to Scotland, and the mountains are even bigger there, aren't they? Or maybe you're going to the Alps, and the Alps, the mountains tower even higher, don't they? Or maybe you've got the chance to go to the Himalayas. And there you see those majestic mountains, the greatest mountains. You see Mount Everest, and you see others. They reach up to the sky, don't they? They're glorious, huge mountains, created by the word of God, set in their place, as it were, by his finger and by his word. But you see, there are greater mountains than even those, aren't there? This verse reminds us of that. Your righteousness is like the great mountains. Your judgments are great deep. See, my friends, that's why we need God's mercy. Because sin is serious, and God is righteous, and God is holy. But you see, verse 5 tells us that God's mercy, his covenant love, his faithfulness is in the heavens. You see, I don't think there's any mistake here in what David is doing. You can't think of anything higher than a great high mountain. But there is something higher than a great high mountain. It's the heavens. It's the clouds. It's what's above the mountains. And deep. But God's loving kindness is like the heavens. It is almost as it were higher. Seeing the clouds and seeing the sky. And this psalm encourages us to see that although God is righteous, and although he is holy, and although he must judge sin for its seriousness, God's mercy, his loving kindness, is there in the heavens. Now, my friends, we need to stop here. About me. Is that the description of my life? Because you see, outside of Jesus Christ, unless you've come to Christ for forgiveness, that's how it is, my friends. You can't save yourself. Your good works, your kind attitudes, your church attendance, your giving to charity, whatever it might be, cannot undo the description of those first 4 verses. But you see, my friends, Christ has come, and Christ has died, and Christ has epitomized this glorious loving kindness of our God. And his mercy can deal with your sin. And if you come to him this morning, you can find forgiveness, and you can find peace, and you can find loving kindness in the Lord Jesus Christ. Why do we need God's mercy, his loving kindness? Because our sin is serious, and because God is righteous. We need to come to him. We need to plead with him this morning for his mercy, for his loving kindness. But then secondly, you'll notice, I trust, how precious is your loving kindness. That's where David goes next. He's begun to think about God's mercy. He's turned his eyes away, as it were, from the wickedness all around him. He's meditating upon his God. He's thought about his hesed, which is in the heavens. And he says, how precious is your loving kindness, O God. How priceless is your loving kindness, O God. Is God's loving kindness to you so precious? Is it something which is priceless in your eyes and in your heart? Because that's what the psalmist says here, doesn't he? Why? Why does he do that? Well, look at the rest of verse 7. Therefore the children of men put their trust under the shadow of your wings. Isn't that a lovely verse? Isn't that a beautiful verse? That we can put our trust under the shadow of God's wings. The God of Hesed, the God of mercy and of faithfulness, as verse 5 puts it. We can rest under the shadow of his wings. See, that's a lovely picture drawn from nature, isn't it? A picture of the hen and the chicks. And whenever there's danger around, or whenever the storm begins to brew, you see those chicks come in, as it were, and sheltering under the outstretched wings of the mother hen. That's the picture that we have here, that we can shelter under the shadow of his wings. You see, isn't that good? Because so much of our lives are lived under other shadows, aren't they? You may be living your life at the moment under the shadow of a serious illness. And that illness casts its shadow over every aspect of your life. We have a dear brother in the church at home who's had cancer for 13, 14 years. And the doctors have done so well. And he's been well up till now, but it seems as if we're coming towards the day of his home call. And it's been lovely to talk to him and to pray with him. And he's lived his life under the shadow of cancer for years. But he's also known that he's living his life under the shadow of a God who loves him, and whose loving kindness is towards him, and whose loving kindness is precious. And maybe that's how it is with you. Maybe there are other shadows that cast long darkness over your life. Maybe it's the shadow of bereavement. Maybe it's the shadow of struggling to make ends meet. Maybe there's some great problem in the family, and it just casts a shadow, and you feel as if you're living your life in the dark because this great thing has a shadow over you. And here's this verse. It tells us that because of God's loving kindness, we're under the shadow of his wings. There's no safer place to be. There's no better place to be. In all of the experiences of our lives, to know that we're under the shadow of his wing. We sang that lovely hymn just now, didn't we, about the loving kindness of our God. And I trust that as we sang it, you traced it through, and you saw how every verse ends with a description of the loving kindness of God. And Samuel Medley, who wrote the hymn, he goes through different experiences of his life, doesn't he? And he traces God's loving kindness in it. Starts with conversion, doesn't he? Saw me ruined in the fall, yet loved me notwithstanding all. He saved me from my lost estate, his loving kindness, oh how great. Through numerous hosts of mighty foes, though earth and hell my way oppose, he safely leads my soul along. His loving kindness, oh how strong. When trouble, like a gloomy cloud, has gathered thick and thundered loud, he near my soul has he near my soul has always stood. His loving kindness, I forgot his loving kindness changes not. And we sang those 7 verses, didn't we? And that wasn't enough. One brother led us to sing the last verse again. So we sang 8 verses of it, didn't we? You know, when Samuel Medley wrote it originally, he wrote 12 verses. And you can look at the other verses on the internet if you want to. We don't like singing 12 verses. Our legs ache, don't they? And our voice goes. And so they've all been edited down for us, but our forefathers used to sing the words, you know. Listen to some of the other verses. When I was Satan's easy prey, and deep in debt and bondage lay, he paid his life for my discharge. His loving kindness is so large. When earthly friends forsake me quite, and I have neither skill or might, he's sure my helper to appear. His loving kindness is so near. And then we sang the last verse, didn't we, about us mounting and soaring away. And that was such a great verse. We needed to sing it twice. Thank you, brother, for leading us in it. Then let me mount and soar away to the bright world of endless day, and sing with rapture and surprise his loving kindness in the skies. There are two more verses after that. Listen to them. There with their golden harps I'll join, and with their anthems mingle mine, and loudly sound on every chord the loving kindness of the Lord. And when earth's rightful king shall come to take his ransomed people home, I'll sing upon that blissful shore his loving kindness evermore. See, that's medley. Traces the loving kindness. Why does he do that? Well, because of what's in this verse. Your loving kindness is precious, because all through the experiences of our lives, we shelter under the shadow of his wings. And that, of course, leads to satisfaction, doesn't it? Look at verse 8. They are abundantly satisfied with the fullness of your house, and you give them drink from the river of your pleasures. Isn't that a verse we want to tell people? We live in a society, don't we, where people are thirsty for satisfaction. They're looking for satisfaction everywhere. Not so long ago, I happened to be in Newport railway station at 8 o'clock on a Saturday evening. Not somewhere I've often found, but that's how it was. And I hadn't been in Newport city centre at 8 o'clock on a Saturday evening. My, what a sight. How depressing. Seeing the state that people were in. This was 8 o'clock in the evening. I shudder to think what they're like at 1 o'clock on a Sunday morning, or 3 o'clock when the clubs and the pubs chuck people out. But there were people who were thirsty, were longing for satisfaction, who were drinking, trying the broken cisterns, as the hymn writer puts it, and finding that the water fails. And the psalmist says to us, because of God's loving kindness, we are abundantly satisfied by what he gives us. You give them drink from the river of your pleasures. Are you beginning to think in New Testament terms now? There were thirsty people in Jesus' day, weren't there? There was a woman who was at a well, and she was letting down the bucket, wasn't she, at noon? She'd gone there, perhaps because nobody else was there in the heat of the day. And she was a woman who was thirsty. She was a woman who'd had all of these husbands. She was a woman who had tried for pleasure here, there, and everywhere. And Jesus says to her, I'll give you the living water. How can you give me the living water? The well is deep, you haven't got a bucket. Oh, Jesus is the living water, isn't he? And when we look at verse 8, our minds go to the New Testament, don't they? And they go to the Christ who promises to give us the water that satisfies. Why? Well, look at verse 9. For with you is the fountain of life. In your light we see light. You notice how verse 9 is about life and light. And the Lord Jesus Christ is about life and light, isn't he? We've just quoted from John chapter 4, haven't we? But you remember how John's gospel begins, doesn't it? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him. Without him nothing was made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. You see, life and light are found in Jesus Christ. Are you in the dark this morning? Are you trying the broken cisterns? Are you looking for satisfaction? Satisfaction comes through the loving kindness of God. Living water flows through the loving kindness of God. Light and life come from God alone, and they are centered in great David's greatest son. And it's to him you must come this morning if you want to be satisfied, if you want to be safe, if you want to live your life under the shadow of Almighty God. How precious, the psalmist says, is your loving kindness, O God. So we've seen our need for God's loving kindness, his hesed, his mercy. We've seen how precious it is. And then verse 10 ends with a prayer that God might continue in his loving kindness to us. You see it there in verse 10. Oh, continue your hesed, your loving kindness, your covenant faithfulness to those who know you. Now, we might look at this and we might say, well, why does he do that? Surely God is love. Surely God's nature is love. All of those things that you've said already as we've gone through this psalm, surely it makes a prayer for God to continue his love towards us. Surely it makes that redundant. Surely that's God's job. Surely that's God's nature. Surely it must be the case that God cannot but continue his loving kindness. And in one sense, you'd be right to say that. But you see, those promises are not there to stop us praying. They're there to encourage us to pray. They're there to give us a basis for our prayer life. When we think about something like the loving kindness of God, we don't just sit back, as it were, and just know that it's going to flow. Oh, we say, God, I want you to continue your loving kindness to me. The promises of God should act as that impetus to us to pray through those promises, to express to God our dependence upon him. And that's what the psalmist says here, doesn't he? Oh, continue. It's as if he says, I don't want to step one more foot in this world unless I know that you're going to go on showing your hesed to me. Unless I know that every day I'm going to experience it. Maybe he's writing this in a cave, surrounded by his enemies. I don't know. And it's as if he's saying, I'm not going to step out of this cave unless I know you're going to go with me. Unless I know your loving kindness will continue towards me. You see where he is in verse 11, don't you? Let not the foot of pride come against me. Let not the hand of the wicked drive me away. First line of verse 11 could be translated the foot of the proud, or it could be translated the foot of pride itself. And I suggest to you, it probably means both of those things. You see, we live in a world, don't we, where we are surrounded by the wickedness. We are surrounded by evil. We are surrounded by sin. The very air we breathe almost is contaminated by the wickedness of men and women in their rebellion against God. That's how it is in our land, isn't it? There is no fear of God before their eyes, verse 1. And everything results from that. And so we are dependent upon God's loving kindness, aren't we? And we want him to watch over us and to keep us. We want, in the midst of the spiritual battle that we find ourselves, to know God's loving kindness towards us. But it's not just the proud, is it? It's the foot of pride. Because as we said earlier on, sin isn't what's out there. Sin's what's in here, isn't it? And we can all know, and we can all testify to those times when pride within us has welled up. And we've stopped trusting in God, and we've stopped relying upon his loving kindness. And the psalmist says, I don't want to be in that place. I don't want pride to well up within me. I don't want the foot of pride to come against me. And so he says, continue your loving kindness to me. That should be our prayer, isn't it? As we get up every day, as we live our lives in this world, we remind ourselves that we would be nothing and we would be lost, but for the mercy and the loving kindness of God. We position ourselves under the shadow of his wings, and we know how precious his loving kindness is to us. And we go on. Until that day when we mount and soar away, until that day when with rapture and surprise we sing his loving kindness in the skies. We go on, asking him to continue his loving kindness towards us. Let's close our worship by singing 528. 528. O Christ, in thee my soul hath found, and found in thee alone the peace, the joy I sought so long, the bliss till now.